Hello, I'm Salia Stremska and you're watching Eastern Express here on TVP World. In this episode, we are going to try and answer the question of just how ready NATO is for a possible military confrontation with Russia. Not saying that it is going to happen, but it's been over 2.5 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, something that to the very last minute seemed unthinkable. Now NATO countries are no longer in denial. Things that one found difficult to fathom not so long ago now are not out of the realm of possibility. Now hold your horses, you still have ample time to look for the nearest bunker or a civil defense manual from the Cold War era. Things, however, are not looking great. Former British Defense Secretary Grant Shapps just recently said something to the effect that European countries are still trying to switch from a post-war mindset to a pre-war mindset. To find out more, let's take a look at this report.
Turning that switch to a pre-war mindset should also do away with misconceptions about NATO's readiness to defend itself against a hypothetical attack from Russia.
Russia, together with its allies, is gearing up for a major show of force. The current target for defense spending by NATO countries will not be enough.
The current threshold for members' defense expenditures amounting to 2% was agreed upon a decade ago. While the US and Western flank countries such as Poland, Romania, the Baltics and Finland exceed the benchmark, some other members have not met the criterion yet. Meanwhile, Germany's secret services have become increasingly wary of Moscow's war machine not slowing down, and Russian forces growing hardened on the battlefields of Ukraine.
The Russian armed forces will probably be in a position, in terms of personnel and material, to launch an attack against NATO by the end of this decade at the latest.
Growing Russian espionage activities in Europe is evidence of these intents. The chief of Germany's domestic intelligence agency, Thomas Haldenwang, said that Moscow has been increasingly recruiting the criminal underworld to spy for money. Espionage activities have primarily involved drone recon of military facilities and critical infrastructure. Haldenwang warned that espionage could quickly turn into sabotage. Earlier this month, a package caught fire in a DHL logistics center in the German city of Leipzig, moments before it was supposed to be placed in the cargo hold of a plane. On Tuesday, a similar incident involving a package sent from Lithuania to the UK happened at a logistics warehouse outside Birmingham.
Russia is waging a hybrid war against almost all countries of the European Union in order to discourage support for Ukraine.
In April, 2 British men faced charges of aiding Russian intelligence following the suspected arson of a warehouse owned by a business with Ukrainian connections.
And now, as usual, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. European countries are now realizing that peace is in fact a result of being able to maintain a fragile equilibrium, and Russia is not a reliable partner. And the thing is, many experts are sounding the alarm. Due to decades of taking the possibility of a war for granted and cutting defense spending, etc., NATO's combat readiness in Europe has declined, or fell off like a rock of a cliff into the sea with a splash. The picture is pretty dismal. Imagine being a boxing champion, even Rocky Balboa himself, walking into the ring and then realizing, and being surprised by it, that you're not your former self. Well, perhaps it's because you have not trained for the past 30 years. To explain where this stems from, let's take a look at what happened following the end of the Cold War, when European countries, feeling all warm and fuzzy with peace, decided to slash their defense budgets. France, for instance, is a good example here. The country cut its military spending by a staggering 56% between 1990 and 2024. France, however, still has over 200,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, Britain, once the home of a globe-spanning empire, will have just 73,000 soldiers by next year, the lowest number since the Napoleonic Wars. Yes, you heard that right, since the early 1800s. When the entire globe's population was just 1 billion. Germany's military is also not in the best shape. According to Maki Bergman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, it would be a significant achievement if Germany could send a single brigade of a few thousand soldiers to the Baltic region right off the bat. And France, mobilizing 20,000 soldiers could take a month. But that time, Russia could have already sent out postcards from Paris. You might be thinking, wait, why don't they just call in more soldiers? Well, it's not that simple. Europe's not too keen on reinstating mandatory military service. Apparently, governments don't believe that a bunch of rookies can replace seasoned professionals. Plus, forcing young people to drop everything and join the military, politically speaking, it's a fast track to getting voted out of office. So getting the numbers right is a problem, and it's not just about the troops. Now, here comes the fun part. Let's talk about money. NATO members pledged to increase their defense spending to 2% of GDP back in 2014. And here we are, 10 years later, and only 10 out of 32 member countries have hit that target. In other words, most European countries are acting like a kid being forced to clean their bedroom. Sure, they will do it eventually, but only after being yelled at multiple times. In the end, unless Europe's NATO members start taking its military preparedness seriously, they may find themselves in a very uncomfortable position. And here, to share more light on the issue, is Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer, University College, London. Hello, sir. Delighted to have you with us.
Hello. Delighted to be here.
So let me start with the crux of the matter. Is NATO ready for a possible confrontation with Russia?
Well, I would say that the confrontation is already underway. It might not be an open military conflict like we'd expect from the Cold War era or from books and movies and so on. But currently there is a conflict with Russia, and you could define it, what's currently going on, as a war, even if bombs are not falling. Certainly NATO does need to beef up its defenses. Certainly it needs to invest more, and that's across NATO. That's pretty much every country. But right now there are plenty of things we can do in order to prepare both public and private citizens in the NATO countries for the situation we're in.
And what could that involve, actually?
It could involve more honest messaging around about the situation we've got with Russia. When, for instance, I see representatives of the Russian state, there could be ambassadors, there could be politicians, so on and so forth. When I see them interviewed on foreign television, in foreign media, there seems to be some understanding that we are talking about, if you like, bloodless affairs, that we are talking about affairs that can be settled through debate, through discussion, through compromise. That is unfortunately not where we are at the moment. We are in a situation where plenty of people in the West believe that if only we could sit down and talk with Russia, some sort of accommodation, some sort of medium solution can be found. There is unfortunately no medium solution in the current day situation. If Russia is not removed from the entirety of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory, then we will be in a situation where for the next 10, 15, 20 more years, not only Russia but other countries seeking to make territorial gains around the world will do precisely that. That is incompatible with the stated mission of NATO and with what at least Western countries state that they are in favor of. So we are right now in a conflict between two worlds of how the world should be, and frankly more open and honest debate about that from policymakers around the world would be helpful.
Right, but even if Volodymyr Zelensky was talking about perhaps sitting down to a negotiating table with Russia during this next Ukraine peace summit, this possible summit. And you're saying that no dialogue is possible with Russia. So how to navigate that situation?
Dialogue is possible, but only if Russia upholds international law as existing within the UN system, and that includes removing its troops and removing its influence from territory that is internationally recognized as belonging to Ukraine. Now, don't get me wrong, in the medium to longer term, the West does need to find a way of coexisting with Russia, also after the Putin regime, because there's no reason to suspect that the eventual departure of Putin would necessarily change Russia's view of the world. But we can only coexist with Russia. We can only have a relationship shaped around, if you like, mutual recognition and some level of mutual respect, if that exists within a mutually agreed framework. That framework is international law, as Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated. That means that for dialogue to take place, Russia, a precondition would have to be Russian removal from Ukraine's territory. We cannot compromise on that. If Ukraine decides to go in and have a negotiation about that, that is their decision, but the West cannot do that on their behalf. And that, regrettably, is the message I see coming out from quite a few opinion makers and even some policymakers in the West.
So what kind of leverage can the West use in order to persuade Russia to do something like this? Or perhaps shall we wait for their resources to become exhausted, for their military to weaken further?
Yes, your question is a very good one. The problem with some of the Western debate is that there seems to be an idea that it is either complete win or bust, in the sense that either Russia collapses completely as a country, which is not going to happen, or the West will have lost. No, what the West should do very simply is to send a message both to Russia but also to itself that it will only have a minimal amount of contact, minimal amount of mutual engagement with Russia as long as this problem persists. Now, Russia can still turn to countries like China, a few other countries as well, which will be able and willing to invest in the country. And Russia has plenty of resources itself, so it can keep going. But make no mistake, Russian policyholders, A, have a problem with their economy, which is only growing, for instance, in terms of inflation, lopsided investment in military affairs, so on. But B, Russia also has a problem because it is becoming increasingly dependent on countries like China. And that is something Russian policyholders are quite worried about. They would like to have a number of options. So in the medium to longer term, it will absolutely be in their interest to get open access again to Western engagement, Western markets, and so on. And we just have to make clear that that will only happen once international law has been restored.
Right, so perhaps China could indeed be a key to trying to persuade Russia to change their actions. I mean, especially because Xi Jinping during the BRICS summit mentioned, right, that BRICS should be concentrating on peace, on the world peace, maintaining it. What is your take on that?
I think it's quite clear that China does not see too many benefits from this war. Having said that, they also see no benefits from a Russia that clearly loses the war or ends up in significant socioeconomic trouble. So I think what the West can do in terms of China is to keep reinforcing the message that China should under no circumstances increase its assistance to Russia. It should not do that, but also that China should put informal, behind-the-scenes pressure on Russia in order to scale down and eventually end this war. Whether such talks with China will work, I do not know, particularly if we have a change of administration in some Western countries like the US. But we should certainly keep doing it. I mean, I think what you were hinting at is quite right. China would like this war to go away so it can go back to clear investment, for instance, in its Belt and Road Initiative and so on. So there might be some sort of mutual understanding between the West and China on this matter. I'm not overly optimistic, but it is worth exploring a bit more.
Right, so you've mentioned the US, and of course we have the November elections coming up. So how significant will they be for NATO's efforts? And do you think it's possible for the US to withdraw from NATO if a Republican candidate, for instance, wins?
Well, they can do to some extent. It will also depend on who's running the Congress, who's running Senate and House of Representatives. Obviously, as you will know, the American election right now is very much up for grabs. It is difficult to see who will win. But if Donald Trump wins the election, then it seems likely that he will downscale or completely withdraw American support for Ukraine. That will have immediate consequences, of course, but I think in the medium to longer term, it's worth focusing more on what the Europeans can do themselves in order to shore up European solidarity, including also solidarity for Ukraine. In the medium to longer term, even if Kamala Harris wins, even if the Democrats win the election, America is likely to scale down its involvement in Europe. It won't be as fast as it would be under Donald Trump, but it will happen. And the Europeans, they have to start, as you are beginning to see some signs of now, the Europeans have to start investing more themselves in shoring up security and prosperity on the continent, and also making clear to both America, Russia, China, and the rest of the world that Europeans are ready and able to take responsibility for their continent.
Right. So, I mean, speaking about this responsibility, it seems that Europe was taken aback by what happened with Russian invasion on Ukraine. However, over these 2 years, how much has changed in terms of Europe's military might? I mean, some countries did start investing more in their arsenals. What is your assessment of that?
I think the signals that have come out so far after 2022 have been much more encouraging than the signals that came out after 2014, when, as you remember, after Russia had invaded Ukraine, there was very limited Western response. This time the signals are much more encouraging, and you are beginning to see collaboration, for instance, recently increased collaboration between Britain and Germany, say, military collaboration and otherwise securing the community, securing the states against outside interference. But these investments, they take time. We're talking about 5-10 years before we can see the benefits of them. And what I can see as quite a dangerous threat here is, let's say, for instance, some sort of misguided accommodation was made with Russia over Ukraine. Russia gets some Ukrainian lands, the war scales down, you don't have the same level of daily casualties coming out, and everybody forgets about that conflict. Then I can still see Western collaboration internally, so say British-German, but otherwise collaboration inside Europe. I can see that slowly disappearing because policymakers in the West get other interests. That would be very, very dangerous. To stress what I said before, even if Vladimir Putin was to leave the stage tomorrow, and he is an elderly man, it could happen. But even if he does that, there is no reason to suspect that, say, the Russian public sphere will be less dominated by the current people than it is now, that it will become less belligerent in the next 5 to 10 years. The West has to stay alert to this and has to keep ramping up its internal security so it is prepared should threats like this happen again from Russia and elsewhere. As I'm saying, I can see encouraging signs that this is happening, but it's an ongoing process which absolutely is not finished and won't be finished for several years.
And I think this is a great conclusion to our talk. Rasmus Nilsson, University College London, thank you, sir, for being with us. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And now, traditionally, we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Moscow is formalizing its military cooperation with Pyongyang. The lower house of Russia's parliament has approved a treaty that ensures mutual military backing.
Allowing for military and other assistance between Russia and North Korea, the treaty follows a June agreement reached in Pyongyang between Russian despot Vladimir Putin and his North Korean counterpart Kim Jong-un. The deal states that should one side be attacked or enter a state of war, the other is obligated to immediately provide military and other assistance using all means at its disposal. The development took place against the backdrop of South Korean and United States claims of evidence that North Korean troops are in Russia, potentially participating in training exercises.
Meanwhile, Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko has praised, quote, the BRICS philosophy during the bloc summit this week in Russia. He even said Belarus was ready to become member of the club. Here's the full story.
Lukashenko announced Belarus's readiness at becoming an active member of the BRICS group. The dictator went on to say that Belarus approached the group with concrete ideas and projects. Belarus was one of the 13 nations that were announced as partner countries within the BRICS group. Earlier this year, the bloc expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran and the United Arab Emirates. While Russia has increasingly portrayed BRICS as a counterweight to Western influence in global affairs, bloc members such as Brazil and India have not aligned with Moscow's hardline stance.
One could say third time's the charm, but in case of Bulgaria, it may be 7 or more. Whether the country will finally be able to haul itself out of the quagmire of failed governments is to be decided in the nearing snap elections.
On October 27th, Bulgarians head to the polls for the 7th time in 4 years. This time there's little hope for constructive change for the poorest and possibly the most corrupt European Union member state. Polls released on Thursday showed no decisive winner and little avenue for a plausible coalition. The growing jadedness of Bulgarian voters is anticipated to show in a turnout of 30%, the lowest since the fall of communism. According to the Sofia-based Alpha Research pollster, centre-right GERB was leading with nearly 27% of support, the reformist We Continue the Change party boasting almost 15%, and the ultra-nationalist pro-Russian Revival party scoring a little over 14%. With prospects for a surprise political partnership or a unifying leader taking hold of the reins of politics looking bleak, the bulk of analysts expect voters to return to the ballot box early next year.
Meanwhile, Ukraine has experienced a staggering demographic decline since Russia's full-scale invasion, losing roughly a quarter of its population. The war has exacerbated long-term population challenges driven by plummeting birth rates, casualties, and a massive refugee crisis.
According to a United Nations report, Ukraine has suffered a severe demographic decline since the Russian invasion, with the country losing about 10 million people. The population, which stood at over 50 million after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, had already shrunk to about 40 million by 2021. The ongoing war has dramatically accelerated this decline. According to the UN Population Fund for Eastern Europe, the birth rate in Ukraine has plummeted to around 1 child per woman, one of the lowest in the world. By contrast, a stable population requires a fertility rate of 2.1 children per woman. War casualties and a massive refugee crisis have contributed to the drop, with 6.7 million Ukrainians now living abroad, primarily in Europe. A full assessment of the war's demographic impact, however, will require a post-war census. The crisis has left regions nearly depopulated, and couples are increasingly unable to start families.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Eastern Express. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.